All right, this is Andy McNeill, and I'm here with Scott Lafontaine, who's an assistant professor of food chemistry at the University of Arkansas. And today we're going to talk about all things beer and rice. But first, I want to introduce you, Scott. Scott, how you doing? You doing all right?
Yeah, great. Great to be here, Andy, and looking forward to chatting with you about this.
And so Scott and I have talked a little bit beforehand, and Scott, there's some things I said that we have a little bit in common. I don't know, are you from Oregon? I know, or did you grow up there, or did you just go to school there?
Just went to Oregon State University. So I was there for 10 years.
So for a long time.
Yeah.
I had a little stint where my father, who worked for the Coca-Cola company, was transferred. And so I went to a good bit of high school and middle school up in Portland, a place called Lake Oswego. I don't know if you know where that is.
Totally.
Know? Yeah.
I mean, I was in Corvallis, but really love Oregon. Just it's a great state, great natural outdoor state.
And so, well, when we talk about food chemistry, I thought I would just give a little intro. I mean, you certainly are well credentialed. I mean, I think, as I understand it, you've got an undergraduate degree in chemistry and molecular biology,
yep.
And then a master's degree, and then another master's degree in chemistry, and then a PhD in food science.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, how long does something like that take to get through?
It was quite a bit. I mean, the double masters really occurred because so I grew up in New Jersey, and I went to a small D3 school there called Kane University, and then they had a 5-year master's degree program. In New Jersey, they had this Rising Stars program where you basically could go for your undergraduate degree if you were in the top 20% of your class for free, or basically close to that cost.
Okay.
So I entered into that 5-year master's program, got really into chemistry, got really into microbiology, and then realized I want to do this more and started to look for graduate programs, and then landed on Oregon State. The program I initially got into was the chemistry program. So I was on my path to get a PhD in chemistry, started working with a woman, Dr. Stacy Simonich, who was the head of, who now is the head of the ag department there. But she was an environmental kind of toxicologist chemist. And we were looking at air pollution plumes. So essentially in Asia, a lot of heat is from coal fire combustion. And that heat would, from that, chemicals would rise. They would transport over the Pacific, and we'd have these air samplers on the top of those mountains. And then my job was basically to take those air samples, extract them, and look at the pollution.
Interesting.
But the job outlook was not very good. Most of the students were going up into Canada and working at the tar sands. And so then, I hadn't thought about the application of my skill set. And I asked that question, and then that's what I transferred into food science. And basically the skill set I learned to look at those air pollution plumes and on the air samplers was the same thing that I could use to look at food quality. And at that time, when the mentor that I worked with during my PhD was Tom Shellhammer, and he's kind of the leader, I would say, in brewing science in the U.S. right now, and particularly working on hops. So I could apply basically that same skill set to look at hop quality.
Excellent. So, one of the things that I find really interesting about food science, and this is, well, actually, let me back up for a second. When I think about everything you just said, what it made me think about was when I went to college, I thought I wanted to be an engineer. And so, like a lot of people, and chemistry got in my way. So the idea to be able to get all the way through a PhD in chemistry, I find super impressive. I ended up majoring in accounting, which is much more boring. But, but when I think about food science, one of the things I think is really interesting and especially important, I think, for society is just the diversity of food culture, and I know that in Bentonville and Fayetteville and Northwest Arkansas, we've had, a transformation over the last decade in terms of just the number of restaurants and the kind of restaurants. Tell me, how does food science sort of intersect with some of that? And I assume it intersects all over the place.
That's why I love it, to be honest. And a little bit about the position here at the University of Arkansas. So technically, I'm an assistant professor of food chemistry, but I help to co-direct the University of Arkansas Center for Beverage Innovation and our certificate for brewing science. And to get back to the original question, in brewing science, you have these, in particularly food science, it's microbiology influences chemistry, right? So you can't necessarily think about these things in silos because one directly impacts the other. Same thing with agriculture, right? Like
Right.
as we grow this crop for particular purposes or just grow for yield, environment affects that, genetics affects that. And so, what inputs you put in, fertilizer, like the pest that might be on that crop, like all these things influence end quality, and then how you process, whatever value added material you're creating or product, like the original quality of that raw material is so interconnected to the quality of the value add. And so, all these disciplines interplay. And that's why I love it. Like in chemistry, I was very siloed and had a very specific mindset, right? Whereas here, you're thinking about all these cross-cutting disciplines.
Yeah, because and I want to get into that. I want to understand more about this center because I also find that really fascinating. I think that there's a lot of foresight to like even do something like that. But let's just tee up some other things and that way we can give folks a kind of a perspective here. Just in terms of just beer and beer consumption. And I'm going to broaden this too. But so Arkansas ranks 40th in beer consumption on a per capita basis. We've got 49, what I could find was 49 companies that are craft brewers in the state, which also is an interesting exercise for me because later I want to hear your opinion on these different ones, which ones you like. That craft beer industry is about $500 million in size in the state of Arkansas, which I also thought was really interesting. And then, and I know that there's a lot of work related to how we incorporate rice. I know that the Senate and the legislature in Arkansas passed a bill last year that basically lowers or gives a tax credit against excise taxes if you put at least 20% of rice, and there's probably other ingredients that are Arkansas based in beer. And then, but there's a handful of distillers. There's a handful of other types of like, cider oriented businesses. So there's a lot of business here in the state of Arkansas related to beer distillers, but also rice. Of course, is we're the number one producer in rice. 1.4 million acres under cultivation. 50% of all U.S. rice comes from the state of Arkansas. There's about 2,000 rice farmers, which part of my family or my wife's family are rice farmers, and about $6 billion of GDP comes from rice, and Arkansas's GDP is about 151 billion and 25,000 jobs. So it's pretty interesting to me how we can take agriculture and then also cross it with food science.
I mean, to me, I feel very fortunate about the mentorship. And, in my PhD project, I got to know a lot about hops in the agricultural sector. And I would, one of my projects, basically, like I slept on a hop farm, and the farmer would come out, and razz me, but essentially, like, to really understand, I think brewers and farmers are the observationalists of our time, right?
Yeah.
They may do what they do and they know why they do it. But, as a scientist and as a chemist, I can help to understand those molecular level kind of understandings just to add some more insight on to that practice, for example. And so I've always had that kind of mentality because, as my differentiation between like a winemaker and a brewer, we have four main ingredients: a grain where we're getting starch, hops, water, and yeast.
Okay.
And we take those ingredients and through different processes, we can really modulate, a lot of different flavor characteristics. And most of the time, throughout history, the quality of those ingredients has shifted, or, we have limited access to that. So for example, like if we're going to talk a lot about rice today, when the German immigrants first came to the US, the barley that we had in the US was terrible quality, right? It was
Okay, I didn't know that.
6-row barley. It was mainly feed barley, and it was very, very high in protein. And so when we started to, the brewers started to use that, Adolphus Busch, it created terrible beer. And so then we started to use rice to dilute that protein and create a very similar profile to what they would have had in Germany at that time, or at least try and replicate it. And rice wasn't added because it was cost effective. It was added because of that flavor um, perspective. And that's sort of like something that I've seen is a lot of people defer and think rice is this cheap ingredient. It's not, right? And so part of this and what we're doing is the reframing of that.
How much when you make it? So how much rice goes into beer?
It depends on the recipe and your goal. So, for example, one of the top rice brands in the country, right? We have Anheuser-Busch. They're the largest end user of Arkansas rice, and they use rice in a particular way. They like that neutrality, that crisp character. And let's say, for example, Michelob Ultra, that would be a majority of rice, in the grist bill, maybe over 50%.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Grist. Yeah. So,
yeah, because maybe you can back up, because I'm not even all that educated. Tell me this, just like from a food chemistry perspective. When I look at something that's like an IPA or a pale ale or a lager, in just like layman's terms, what is there? You probably know it. What's the food ingredient differences?
So those 4 ingredients, it's amazing because you have thousands of iterations that you can adjust in that, right? So, for example, in the brewing process, there's a lot that you can modulate. So with wine, right? Quality wine comes from quality grapes, right? Like you're not going to get a $300 bottle of Cab just from, a bulk orchard. That orchard is going to be like very well tended, has been maintained for a very long time, for example, in a particular area in California or, whatever area in France. Whereas with beer, just because of how I think that product has evolved over time, there's so many iterations that exist that could be cultural, that could have been because that style exists because there was limited access to ingredients, due to pressure or whatever, or highlighting local ingredients, which is something that I think rice really can be for us in the Delta region, or your brewing equipment. Like just the equipment that you had available also changes the taste of your product. So the same recipe executed on 2 different breweries, that beer might taste different.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And all those different changes are going to form these different varieties of beers.
Exactly. But just generally, right, we have this grain, and the grain is going to have, it stores its energy as starch. And we want to convert, like the goal of a brewer is to convert that starch into fermentable sugars. Yeast can only eat 3 sugars in size or less. So maltotriose or less. The yeast that we primarily use in the brewing industry is maltose. So yeast really likes a disaccharide. And we use malted material because that malt, as we wet the grain it's just a seed at that point, and the seed thinks it's going to start to grow. Okay. In that growing process, it starts to modify and create enzymes. We don't really want the grain to modify it, but basically in the malting process, those enzymes get created. We dry that down within like a 5-day process. And then what will happen is that malt gets sent to the brewer. They then crack open that malted material. mix the grain with water, and then that's how we break down those starches. So it's really like a lot of biochemistry going on. But depending on the grains you use, like rice is more neutral in flavor than is barley. So when I want a very neutral, sessionable, let's say lager style, I might use a higher proportion of rice.
I see.
Now, what I can do is in the heat, when I have that kernel, I can apply more heat and I can create a very roasty character on the malt. And this might be something like I might use a higher proportion of that to create a stout.
Yep.
Or for an IPA, maybe I'm just using that base malt, but I want a higher alcohol, so I add more grain. So on the grain side, that's some options. And then on the hop side, I can adjust bitterness by more or less hops or how I add them in the process. So just some insights.
For the people all over the world that are brewing beer, is there sort of like a, like a master brewer sort of person that you say like this person is like knows the craft really well? And is that just more art than science, or is there like actually like like getting some other certificate? Is there a process?
So in the US, there's a couple of institutions that historically were there. So Oregon, so UC Davis basically would have been one of the founding, I'd say, US institutions that kind of train people for brewing science. And there is an international accreditation, which is the International Brewers and Distillers exam. And so that's a 3-part exam that Davis basically created a training program for people to take. You could finish it over like the course of 3 months. But now what we see is more and more US programs kind of creating training programs as the growth of interest in, let's say, craft beer has evolved over time. So has the interest in training programs at the university level. And so Oregon State, Colorado State University,
Right.
now Arkansas are offering these programs to train talent for that industry.
Well, one of the things I find so interesting is when I reflect back, like when I was in my 20s, back like in the 80s, and the 90s, um, there wasn't as much variety. I mean, there was a lot of different beers, but there wasn't like the craft beers didn't exist in the same way. My first exposure to craft beer was when I lived in Belgium for a little while. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was you would have beers that were just made in this town. They weren't really out there selling all over the country. But if you rolled into this town, there was this particular beer. And in Belgium, they also came in a certain glass, and so I learned that at least in Belgium culture, if you wanted a pint of beer, that was just the lowest end beer that you could get, which interestingly was Stella Artois, which we don't really think about in the US as a low brand beer, but there it was just considered like, like water in some ways.
Table beer. Yeah.
Yeah, table beer. And so, but I remember, specifically the Trappist beers, Duvel, Leffe, different ones. And it was a great exposure. Is one of the reasons you went to study in Germany because they're good beer, because they know how to make beer?
So historically, the Europeans, right, their training programs date back way, way longer, right? So the institution I went at was the Versuchs- for Brauerei, which is just like a research and teaching institution for beer. And they also offer an international program. So that's another training program that is like, if you're looking out there and you want to kind of get training in this from professionals, that program exists. And I've always had a high amount of just respect for the Europeans from a brewing science perspective, just because that's who was making, like, there's so much history wrapped up in brewing science. Like, for example, Louis Pasteur, we all hear pasteurization,
right?
And we talk about pasteurization, but little do we know pasteurization was really created to create higher quality wine and beer, right? Like he was a hired hand for a winery and a brewery to figure that out. Like,
Mm,
yeah.
I didn't
And
know that.
it's pretty cool when you start to get into it. Like, same thing, at Guinness, like students tea, that statistic was published under the pseudonym of a guy at Guinness, because basically the boss wanted to create a raw ingredient change. And he wanted to stick it to his boss and say, like, hey, if we make this change, actually our consumers are going to be able to tell the difference. Before then,
Interesting.
there was no statistical way in which you could tell these two populations were different. And I just love, as you start to look at the history and how some of these, how some major like humanity changes happen because of, brewers. But in the brewing industry, and sort of observations to make that product better.
Scott, are you pretty familiar with like the beer history in the United States?
Um, just I'm not a historian, but I try and always, like, I have a class here, and so I walk students through that as well.
Because is it one of the things that I found interesting? I actually have a book that's behind me on a shelf that like goes through whiskey in the history of whiskey. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about that, and it makes complete sense when someone's explaining it to you, but that there was a time where like you'd walk into and I'm going to paraphrase here. I walk into like someplace and order a whiskey, and there wasn't brands of whiskey. There was just whiskey, and they would buy it from different people all and the brands sort of emerged later on, like in the late 1800s. Is beer the same way where there wasn't really branding around beer until later on? It was just, if I went into like a saloon 200 years ago, I'd just get a beer. And was
So
it called beer? I don't even know.
yeah, I mean, it would have been beer, because like immigration would have brought that product, and it would have been reminiscent of what it would have been in Europe. I just want to go back one piece to the training in
Okay.
in Germany. Um, so, because I think this also reframes and kind of links into this, because of who established our breweries, our beer market. The way in which the beer industry thinks of beer in the U.S. is through the Germanic lens. So in
Okay.
1516, basically you have this German ruler that dictates, okay, beer is made of barley, and wheat basically is for bread making. And they
Okay.
didn't want those two industries to be competing for raw materials, right? So if one
Oh,
becomes more successful than the other, and so essentially this regulation provides a very strict definition on what beer is. Beer is barley, not any other grain, right? Even though at that time in Germany, you have beer styles that are made in different parts of Germany, like wheat, for example, wheat
right.
ales, or Berliner Weisse, a style that also has an inclusion of wheat in it. And so you have these carve outs that are created, but the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, has really shaped how brewers have thought about beer since then.
I see. Okay.
And why I like that, and why it was fun to go to Germany, is the Germans are incredibly talented and knowledgeable about taking those four ingredients and using the best of each of those ingredients to get the most out of it. Right. And there's something said to be that. So, for example, like um, acid is one thing that we use in the brewing industry. So, Germans can't use acid that's produced by a bacteria. Instead, what they do is they take and create sour malt. And that malt, basically, they take it after they harvest it, they might hydrate it a little bit, they cover it with a tarp, and that allows the bacteria to naturally acidify that malt. What In the US, I wouldn't, unless I was doing a traditional practice, if I needed to modulate my pH in the process, I would just, reach out, get some lactic acid, and then add
Yes.
that lactic acid in. And I'm just using that as an example because when you start to learn how to leverage your raw materials, that gives you a certain mindset. It may be limiting, right? Like, but it also, that tradition and that view on how to get the most of your raw materials was something very valuable to me.
That
Um,
I wonder, like maybe that's a good like sort of jumping on point to just talk about just the brewers in general, because one of the things I perceive it is, I'm sure Anheuser-Busch cares immensely about their product, the quality, the taste, but they're also a massive manufacturing operation, and I'm sure they're trying to drive the cost down as they possibly can. I imagine if I'm a craft brewer here in Arkansas, I might be more of an artist doing what you were implying, which is, trying to get the best ingredients, maybe local ingredients, maybe a little local culture. Um, are you familiar with a lot of the Arkansas, br- you know, uh, um, craft brewers?
I'm beginning
And
to know them more. I'm still fairly new to the area, but like my network in the brewing industry is now like it has a global span. I have a lot of connections to a lot of national craft brewers whose excitement in rice is growing, and also within the state have been connecting with a lot of folks like at Core, Scarlet Letter, or and um, Got a Hold and Ozark and Crisis
right.
and Lost 40. Like, so now that I'm here for a little bit, I'm starting to get to know our brewing community, um, and I do think you're starting to see like people, the word's getting out, right? Like we have this starch source here that you don't have to leverage like Anheuser-Busch does. You can have a different mindset going into how you're going to use that material, how you work with a farmer to grow that material, what
Right.
variety you may need versus their needs. Um, and I just want to back up, like
Yep.
Anheuser-Busch, what they execute day in and day out is absolutely amazing, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah. Of
they
course.
have at the scale that they are and the level at which their quality specifications can't they're like this. They want, regardless of whether or not they're making Michelob Ultra or Bud in Atlanta or they're making in California, like also they're a huge US employer as well, right?
Oh yeah.
Mass.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well,
just I think a lot of times as craft brewers, they give like like some negativity bias towards that. But I just want to, I find it amazing, and they also have been leveraging rice for a very, very long time, so they're super knowledgeable about it as well.
yeah, I don't have any negative. I didn't want to sound. Hopefully, I didn't come off that way. I actually, because I think that if I could create a craft beer, I would want to expand it and grow it and do some. I would replicate what they do and grow these businesses as best I could. And if I were them and somebody did that, I would buy their beer, and I would just expand my book of beers that I've got, and so, yeah, to run a business at scale. I mean, because, I explained some of my businesses before to you, you know, not easy, not easy to scale. It requires a lot of skills to do that for sure. But when I think about the craft brewing or just brewing in general, because here in a second I want to talk about the innovation center that you guys have, but like, I do think that like you can be an artist, right? You could still also say, sort of like the Trappist beers, hey, I'm just going to just do this for this local area, like here in Russellville. I don't know if you're familiar with Point Removed, but
Mhm.
they're a brewer down here. I think they make a really nice beer, you
Yeah.
know. And
And
so,
I think we're spoiled. This is what I tell my students all the time. Like they live, I mean, it's hard right now because beer is in the red. And I mean, I think we're going to see a change in the market. I think there was a lot of investment. Um, and, you know, uh, in states where, potentially, to kind of get back to one of your other questions around sort of like historically how things have changed in the brewing industry here, right? We had a reset. So we had a craft industry where basically local products were being made up till 1920. And then everything is,
yes, yes,
we have
done.
prohibition and we have a massive consolidation of our industry. And so that's regulation having a negative impact on what would otherwise be locally a local industry. And so then it takes until, the 1980s and you have the home brewing bill pass, right? And that starts to create passion and energy, and people realize that you can do this at home, and there's a buy-in. You also have I think some of the tastes that were like, you had folks that were coming back and forth from wars, and they brought that taste of what other beer styles could be, historical beer styles. And then that leads to this growth in the craft industry that now we're very fortunate to be a part of. And now you can go and walk down pretty much anywhere in the US, down to your local city center, and hopefully you have access to very, very fresh craft beer.
Yeah. Yeah. I
You
think
know,
it gives some texture to the culture, right? I think that, it's this it's like it's like a quilt, that we strung together, and, you can kind of just enjoy them all a lot. So, okay. So you do that in Germany. Tell me how you got to Arkansas. How does that happen?
so the model like that I saw in Oregon was essentially a great brewing program has a great agricultural product. And to
Okay.
me, I saw essentially, I see University of Arkansas. It's a top 10 in food science. Like our faculty here are producing great output for the number of that we have. We're bringing in a lot of support for our state. And so those are attractive to me. Like again, a high performing program. The beer certificate program had already been created, so the bureaucracy internally, like I could tell that there was interest in this. And then again, like the third most important agricultural product in the state was rice.
Right.
And so the model of having a successful program, the issue in beer is like while you may get support for some breweries, the margins are too tight to rely on brewers to ballast educational program.
Right. I'd agree with that.
And so you have to have, like, if you want that training program, you have to also have that tied to the ag part, which is what we had in Arkansas. And the other thing that was really, really nice and already set up here is there was a rice processing program that had been created by Dr. Terry Siebermorgan, now is being run by Griffiths Tungaloo. And that program basically was everything that you could think about with rice up until it left the mill. But then we
Okay.
didn't have any expertise, or at least there was no expertise at the university to take that and help with the understanding of how to process it. And so that's what I thought I could bring in from like what my background was, what I could add to the industry and sort of that potential I saw.
Have you started meeting any of the rice farmers? Do you have connections down there with various folks?
When I first got here, rice is a commodity and is treated as a commodity. And I think what's hard about that is what that leads you to practice is growing for yield. And I wanted, I started to think about, like, in the hop industry, what happened is hops were sort of used for bitterness up until 2015. And then brewers really started to use this hop called Citra to drive really unique flavor. And that hop was bred specifically for that purpose.
Okay.
And it was aromatically super unique. The price for a regular, let's say, public variety, let's say $5 a pound. The price for Citra, $30 per pound, because it
Okay.
was bred for premiumization and novelty. Now, what I was looking for in Arkansas, was there a farmer premiumizing the rice that they were growing? Were they growing for a specific purpose? And there was. Isbell Farms.
Oh, okay. Mark.
Yeah. And Mark and Chris and Harrison. And so I reached out to them. And to me, it was fascinating because, in the 70s or 80s, Chris took a gamble to grow Yamada Nishiki and, to grow this rice for the sake industry. And so to me, already the premiumization for purpose, growing your raw material for purpose and linking with an industry existed, right? It's not some crazy idea like, that is new. And why I like that is, generally speaking, the sake industry is about a $300 million industry. Right now, craft beer is 26 billion.
Yeah, it's huge.
Massive, right? And so teaching the thing is, Anheuser-Busch is using the rice that they use. We already kind of talked about that.
Right.
They use the rice in their way, and they're very good at that because in their infrastructure, they have basically, to get kind of nerdy, in grain, to break apart the starch, you have to gelatinize the starch. Starch is stored as little balloons called granules, and you have to disrupt that starch to digest it, to create fermentable sugar.
Okay.
And in barley, that structure, those granules are larger than in rice. So that you have to put more energy, or at least we think you have to put more energy into rice, but it depends on the variety. Again, if we grow rice for craft brewers, there are varieties of rice with lower gelatinization temperatures.
I
AB gets
see.
around that because of their process. They have a vessel that they've already put in the capital investment, that they just boil that material and move it into
Wow.
their process.
I hadn't thought about this till you just said this, but I think this is fascinating. So, let me see if I can regurgitate this. You could connect, our $6 billion rice industry, and you could say, uh, you know, hey, most people are going to, grow for yield. We can understand that, right? And grow for Anheuser-Busch, and that's all super important. But we can take a fraction of what we've got, and you can change the I guess the rice. Is it called variety, cultivar? What's the right word?
I think that the distinction would be like a cultivar would be something that's grown at scale, whereas like a variety, you're kind of selecting right now. So in
Okay,
the lab, what we're doing is we're selecting traits that we know perform well, let's say in this craft brewery setting.
I
And then
see.
what we can do is we could start to work on enterprise budgets where, okay, what are the inputs like fertilizer, pesticide?
I
Because,
Well, that
you know,
makes complete sense. So if I'm a rice farmer at scale, I can say to you, hey, look, the University of Arkansas has an innovation center that's basically taking, and I'm assuming there's hundreds of varieties of rice when you really get down to it, that are experimenting with all these varieties for flavor, for the energy aspect, the aroma. There's all these things you're doing. And so that later you can say, hey, we've got the science to support Mr. Craft Beer person. We can tell you about if you use this, what the results are. And Mr. Farmer, we can tell you that if you grow these people are potential people to buy it. And it's a huge industry. That makes a ton of sense, you know?
exactly. And I've been very fortunate. Again, the pieces at the University of Arkansas and this institution are second to none. Like, we have an amazing agricultural economic department. And I was very fortunate to start working with one of our lead experts, who is now the department head of that department, Dr. Lanier and Ali. And, one aspect is, so Anheuser-Busch uses milled adjunct rice.
Okay.
Another thing that we can do is basically malt rice. It's another value added opportunity and stream. There are going to be specific varieties that you can use for that. And scientifically in the lab, I can prove something out, or me and my students can do that. But it doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. It's pie in the sky if there's no economic value to that, right?
Right, right. I would definitely agree with that. Right. I mean, I like the idea that you can come up with in essence, an analogy might be like, hey, I'm coming up with a way to build an effective bridge, and I can actually go out and build the bridge. You
Correct.
know,
And what
and
has been fabulous is that talent, because it was here, we have been kind of proofing that out now. And we have a paper that's out in Nature Nature's sister journal. And basically, we proof out that essentially um, the cost of malted rice would be 20% more. This was pre-tariff, mind you.
yeah,
It was like last January we were doing these analyses. And um, for a gluten-free material, most material would be like rice. Rice is gluten-free. So if you're celiac, what's great is now this material, this malted rice, basically you can make 100% malted rice beer.
right.
Um, so there's some benefits, but essentially it was 20% more, and in 15% of the cases, almost cost neutral. The one other thing I wanted to say, because I just started to get into grain, the Land Institute has been promoting this grain Kernza, and we have Kernza is a perennial crop, so you don't have to replant it after each harvest. When you look at the yield of Kernza compared to barley, it yields almost a half of barley. How much,
Okay.
from a yield perspective, when we compare rice and barley, how much more do you think rice yields per acre?
Ooh, I don't actually know that. but I'm going to assume that is rice more?
2 to 3x more.
Okay. Yeah.
So when we start to pen this out per land acreage, one, there's no acreage of Kernza. And there's, this is nothing against the Land Institute, but when we're looking about future solutions, again, like my goal was not to make everybody use rice, but to see rice as a tool in the toolbox. Like, again, as a brewer, I started the conversation out. We have all these things that are accessible to us. The Germanic lens has prevented us from actually considering this grain to its optimal potential.
Interesting.
And I think that, as we move forward, we're going to have pressures in our agricultural community.
Yeah, climate change, all sorts of stuff that's happening.
Correct.
And so what you're saying is that, hey, on a yield basis, 2 to 3x barley rice is greater. And if we can break the stigma about what's defined as beer, there's no reason why rice can't be used to make beer, 100% or fractional, that is good for farmers and potentially good for the environment. And so this is the Center for Brewing Innovation, a physical center. Like if I went up there, would I be able to like walk into it?
So right now, there's some there's some funding that we're thinking about a new building.
Okay.
Right now, we're waiting on some decisions for that on the federal level.
Okay.
So we can't move forward until we hear back on that. But we do have the center's already here. Like we have a small brewery that we're doing these trials in. And we've had an experimental winery since 1970. And so the center was a collaboration between Dr. Threlfel and I. And so I kind of bring in the expertise for brewing, and then she sort of serves on the enology part. So helps wineries in the state like Post or Whitaker Farms.
Right. And we don't really have a huge wine industry here, but the beer industry is pretty big, and so.
I think they're roughly equivalent.
Are they really?
In size, in impact. We have American viticulture areas. There's 3 in Arkansas.
That's surprising. I one time looked at buying one of those. And, just from a revenue perspective, it was really small, and so, and I perceived at the time when I looked at that a lot of the, yes, they had a vineyard, but they really had to import most everything that they did, and so, which, and I don't really know enough about wine to really say, do I think we have the best locations? I will say I do know that, I think I'm right when I say this. Up in Mount Nebo, which is down here where we live, down in the River Valley, you may have never heard of it, but it's like a little mesa that goes up a couple hundred acres up on top. And I think I'm correct to say, like back in the 1860s, it was one of the largest vineyards in the United States. So a long time ago. But so you're hoping to get a building, but right now it's just, like in a building, with a handful of folks working on it.
Yeah. And what I think it's pretty cool from a history perspective. I took over a guy, Ron Busher. He was a pickling guy. So worked with Phil Isick, I think. And
Okay.
Yeah. Like pickles crunchy. And there was a closet that basically was his pickling cellar. And so I was fortunate when I came in, they were storing stuff in there. So I was like, can I turn this into like a little mini brewery? And so I ripped the shelves down, and still we're using that space in the essence of fermentation, which I think from a historical perspective is kind of cool.
Oh, that's really neat. Well, I think what you're doing is really interesting, and has all these different ways that it intersects with Arkansas, whether it's the craft brewers, whether it's the farmers, whether it's culture, whether it's just the expansion of people's palates and different tastes and different, kind of being open to it. And we didn't talk about this, but I assume this is other stuff that you care about, but I do think that, what I think is also interesting about this industry is the growth of non-alcoholic beers, because I love a number of them. And I would used to say they were horrible, or at least I thought they were. But, I think Athletic and a number of other ones make a great product. And so, and as I understand it, you could, the fermentation, everything else is the same. You're just taking the alcohol out at the end.
So we specialize. So kind of randomly, I had landed on sort of being an expert in that space. I was very fortunate during my graduate degree in Oregon because of Dr. Schellhammer's global prominence in the space. We would go over to Europe a lot. And I could see, like in the European markets, there was a lot of taste and development going on for non-alcoholic beer. So then I got that opportunity in Germany, but I needed a year for my wife to figure out what she was going to do. I wanted her to have her thing in Germany.
Right.
So then we ended up moving down to Davis, and there was a woman there, Dr. Hildegard Heyman, who basically wrote the textbook on sensory science. If you're unfamiliar with that, basically in sensory science, what we do is we use humans as instruments to rate food. And
Okay.
sometimes that can be consumer perception. You have a bunch of consumers come in and they say, I like this thing a lot, I don't like it. Or, I train a panel of people to certain taste profiles and they rate that. So we did the first North American study on non-alcoholic beer to figure out, we brought in 50 commercial beers from all around the world to figure out what consumers want in those products. And then in Germany, kind of was working on that quality. And then now here at the University of Arkansas, that's a big way, like big research drive is to make that product sector better. And so there's two main ways. You mentioned one where we basically, historically, what we would do is we would make a full strength product, something that contained alcohol. Then we would use distillation and we would remove the alcohol, but keep what was left behind. And then
Okay.
we would turn that into a product. The second way is yeast. We talked about it, maltose. And they basically, that yeast will eat maltose and create ethanol. There are yeasts that we're finding that do not eat maltose. And what you can do is you have a limited fermentation where you create just a little bit of fermentation or alcohol that's under our legal limit, which is 0.5% ABV. And then you just modulate that to create good flavor. And so we're sort of working on figuring out, okay, what are the best commercial strains? And then can we even find local strains in our environment that we could use for this purpose?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it's, I see it everywhere. And just as a consumer, I always have a non-alcoholic beer at my house, and so, and I think they taste, the ones that I'm buying anyway, I think they taste fantastic.
That we're going to see an explosion in this market. I mean, the Surgeon General just this last year listed alcohol as the third leading cause of cancer in the U.S. And so I think, obviously somebody can do whatever they want in moderation.
Yeah, of course.
But I think what we're finding and what we're seeing in the market is that individuals are coming into this non-alcoholic beer space, not necessarily because they have issues with alcohol.
Right.
They're seeking it for health. They're seeking it because they want an alternative. Maybe they're exercising, right? There's a lot of drives for, consuming this product. And I think as product innovators, we're sort of meeting that day. And it's fun, actually. Like, it's way more challenging to create a safe, good tasting NA than it is to make a full strength product at this point. And so,
Really?
yeah,
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Well, listen, keep up the great work that you're doing. Maybe one of these days I can take you to get a coffee or something. I should have also mentioned that I teach at the University of Arkansas as well. I'm an adjunct professor there, or adjunct lecturer, I guess is probably technically what it's called. I teach private equity I teach entrepreneurship, but sort of through the lens of private equity.
I'd love to have you come visit. The other thing that I'd like to just mention is we had this training program, and we're using this brewery also as a training program, and we have that certificate. One thing that's really hard about this in Oregon State, basically, we could serve to minors, and there was legislation that had been passed by our governing body, by the state, that would allow you to serve a very, very small amount, but for training purposes.
Right.
And the reason why I think that law was really good from a training perspective is because if you think about it, you cannot get into this from an employment perspective into this industry until you've already made up your mind about what you want to do in college. By the time you're 21, you've already graduated. You're
Right,
gone.
right.
You've set the path. And so right now at the university, we're kind of exposing people to the employment opportunities and in the alc bev space or bev space in general. But by the time they decide this, that you really are limited in how you can train individuals. And so, from a regulation perspective, I think that was a really healthy thing that was done in Oregon. That again, creating that high quality, uh, um, technically trained uh, um, workforce in your area,
Sure.
like it is important for R&D in that space and economic growth as well. So I just wanted to put that in as a plug.
Yeah, I'd
Uh,
like to see stuff like that done. I mean, I know we're not here talking about this stuff, but like when I was younger, the drinking age was 18, and just from my personal perspective, it should be 18. If you can sign a contract, get married, vote, be committed as a crime as an adult, you should be able to have a beer. But that's just my personal opinion. It's so.
and in this case, that was very, very highly regulated around
Yeah, I understand. You're
what that
you're
was
talking about something
and
from a
defined.
research and training perspective, not what I'm talking about. Something very different. Yeah.
Yeah,
Get it.
and I just it more like I have a class now where I'm training basically freshmen and sophomores, and I use non-alcoholic product because it's gotten so good, and I can train people about what those tastes they should be looking for are. Um, but still, I think that exposure to the employment opportunities that exist or the business economic development opportunities, unless you are exposed to it, you don't know that can be an option to you. So
Right. I totally get it. Um, Scott, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to meet you in person. And, best of luck to all the research and innovation that you're doing. I'm cheering you on. Uh, and hopefully I'll get to taste the product.
come up anytime. Really, just send me a text and love to have you in.
Excellent. All right. Well, have a nice day.